It's China. It's China. I was gonna do a whole mystery thing at the beginning, like, oh, which country do you think it is? Throwing a bunch of red herrings, that classic YouTuber bait and switch, but you saw the thumbnail, let's not kid, it's China. Let's not beat around the bush here. The Chinese game market is real weird. On one hand, they dominate the financial side of the industry, accounting for over 30% of global revenue for both mobile and PC, with a total revenue of nearly 46 billion last year, projected to hit 57 billion in 2027. And it's home to the second largest game publisher in the world, Tencent, which is insane considering its running mates at the top are the console-selling trifecta of Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo. On the other hand, though, next to none of the well-recognized development teams in the world are based in China. Tencent does have significant shares or full ownership of quite a few like Techland, Riot, Epic, and From Software, but none of those are Chinese companies. It's kind of weird to think that China has been dubbed by some as the gaming capital of the world, and yet even avid players would struggle to name a single dev team from China. I mean, I love games. I could name you devs from Canada, South Korea, Ukraine, France, tons of places, but other than Tencent, which is a publisher and not a dev studio, I'm completely blind on most companies that exist over there. So why is that? Well, most of it comes down to how China's history with the games industry has shaped their market in an unusual way. When video games were in their early years, China was the economic equivalent of a dead fish slapping against a soggy piece of bread, and while it would later stabilize just in time to coincide with the rapid growth of the games industry, the high cost of importing games to China led to rampant cases of piracy, black market content, and cheap console knockoffs. Knockoffs that would later have the deep, esteemed honor of being rebranded under the Soulja Boy global enterprise of video games. That is a real sentence that actually happened. By the turn of the century, video game addiction was deemed enough of a potential threat to Chinese youth that game consoles were outright banned for over a decade. And even though it wasn't airtight with rebranded versions of some Nintendo consoles, as well as the PS2 finding their way to China legally, the still high import costs and restrictions on buying software for those consoles made them more trouble than they were worth, and they never really caught on in the region. Piracy shot up even higher given how tough it was to legitimately purchase games in the country. In fact, it shot up so high that legitimate Chinese developers countered the issue by putting all their eggs into the free-to-play games with microtransactions basket, since at this point people weren't really used to the idea of paying for games in the first place. Free-to-play MMOs from other countries also took off in China, and that bled into mobile gaming's meteoric rise in the area, since they also often adopted free-to-play models with ads, subscriptions, or microtransactions. As these games started to catch on, China once again became concerned about their effect on the youth, and so they cracked down on playtime, in some cases requiring kids to log in with government ID to confirm their age, or clearing away the in-game currency the player accrued that day if they played for more than 3 hours straight, which means that even restrictions in the country were reliant on the games as a service model. Despite China's best efforts to counteract the video game problem, they actually unknowingly pushed the most addictive and self-destructing gameplay loops onto their citizens. China saw a massive uptick in revenue from the games industry in the middle of its harshest restrictions, shattering predictions, and in the span of 6 years grew tenfold from about 1.5 billion in revenue in 2007 to 13.5 billion in 2013. 10 years later, that second figure has quadrupled, and China is closing in on becoming the biggest games market in the world, and yet almost none of that revenue is tied to consoles. It's no secret that mobile games are actually the biggest moneymakers in the industry worldwide. Even in the States, they account for the majority of the revenue share, but consoles and console games still have a strong presence, both financially, with them being responsible for a little under 30% of game revenue in the US, and more importantly, in the community. When a new console comes out, it's a big event. All of these award shows and showcases that we watch are there to celebrate and announce new console games. When you go to somebody's house and they say, let's go to the basement and play some games, you assume they're gonna whip out the PlayStation or Xbox, not their phone. That or you're in a Saw movie, but that's really not how it shakes out in China. Despite the console ban being lifted in 2015, consoles and console games make up for 3% of the domestic games market. 3%. I'm pretty sure I by myself make up 3% of the Canadian games market. That is a ridiculously low figure. So it's not really a surprise that China's creative output is a blind spot to so many of us. Their entire brand is built off of free-to-play games, addictive loops, microtransactions, and mobile integration. They don't care about your goddamn game of the years and innovative gameplay and giant universes to explore. They're busy making $3 billion off of Honor of Kings alone. That's where the money is, and so that's what developers will always target. Well, kind of. Recently, Chinese developed titles have been getting a bit more attention worldwide, and not just free-to-play MOBAs or gacha games. Those games are clearly still their bread and butter, with one of their biggest global hits being Genshin Impact, which is on PC and mobile, is free-to-play, and its economy is built around randomized loot boxes, but single-player games without any monetization trickery are starting to crop up a little more often, and the global push from Chinese developers to the console space, which typically has more restrictions than PC and mobile, is also starting to pick up. Bright Memory Infinite is one of the most impressive solo dev projects out there that feels like the love child of Titanfall Fallen Shadow Warrior. Fist Forged in Shadow Torch isn't my favorite Metroidvania, but it's a solidly constructed game with some fun ideas. And even Naraka Blade Point, which is free to play and features in-game purchases, follows more in the footsteps of Western Battle Royale distribution models than anything, and has gameplay that feels more refined than a lot of its contemporaries from China. Fist is actually the result of a Sony-run program called the China Hero Project, which gives resources to small development teams so they can expand their ideas and bring them to a global market. So far, the program, which has been going on for a few years, hasn't produced anything groundbreaking. Fist was a good time and generally positively reviewed. Boundary is in early access right now and got a lot of praise for its fundamentals initially, although it's since received a wave of negative feedback given its rapidly declining player base and inability to matchmake effectively. In Nightmare is cool in theory but suffers from technical problems, but its existence proves that companies are buying into the untapped potential of Chinese devs, and some of the games on the horizon look really promising. Evotinction is a stealth game with hacking mechanics that looks really polished. There's some cool VR stuff in the works. AI Limit looks a little Soulsy, reminds me of Scarlet Nexus, and the most interesting of the bunch, to me at least, is Lost Soul Aside, which started development as a solo passion project, and through the program has added 9 other team members and expanded in scope into a full-fledged hack-and-slash RPG with unbelievably slick-looking combat, huge set pieces, huger bosses, and what looks like an endless list of abilities. The game's set to come out next year, and it probably has the best shot at being the first legit hit to come out of the program, and one of the first significant single-player action games from the country, period, if it can deliver on its potential. But it's not just the Hero Project that's pushing console or single-player development in China. One of the most talked about gameplay demos I've ever seen was for Black Myth Wukong. Overnight, a new IP, at least in games, from a studio that nobody knew felt like it was going to be an absolute game changer. The art design, the enemies, the abilities, the visuals, the combat, the world, there was something special here that a lot of people immediately latched onto. But the game's dev cycle hasn't exactly been without its controversy, both for the poor working conditions at the studio and the claims that the demo was a complete farce and this is just vaporware, which gained traction after insiders in the Chinese dev scene claimed that the game had almost no content, was running into a lot of production problems, and was just putting up an impressive looking vertical slice to attract attention from publishers and secure an ass load of money. For what it's worth though, the team themselves claimed that the game was far from finished when they revealed it, and that the demo was put out to attract talent and fund the project, which it successfully did. And we also have confirmation that it'll appear at Gamescom just a few days from when this video comes out, maybe even alongside a behind closed doors demo. Time will tell whether or not the final game can actually deliver on what's been shown so far, but there's no doubt that this game has gained a lot of attention globally and is targeting a bit of a different audience than the norm for Chinese studios. The same thing can be said about Where Winds Meet and Phantom Blade Zero, which are both fast-paced, and I mean fast-paced action games. Phantom Blade Zero's trailer is insanely cool, and I can't even wrap my head around the fact that this gameplay is real, but at the same time, it could also just not be. The action here is so scripted that there's no telling what the final game might actually be like to play, which is a consistent issue with a lot of these newly announced games from the region. Under that layer of excitement is a strong layer of skepticism. Most of the titles on the horizon seem a bit too good to be true, at least in some respects. They look great in the marketing, but they're also coming from a place where games like this have never been prioritized, and the studios behind them mostly have experience in mobile games. The leap to what's being pitched right now seems kinda hard to believe. In some ways, these games feel like they have aspects that are ahead of the entire industry, which should raise some eyebrows. But at the same time, we've seen glimpses of brilliance out of Chinese studios recently, and extremely high-tempo action seems to already be a staple in some of their notable releases. It really all feels like one big question mark. Will the games that come out of this country continue to be ruled by its past, or will they forge a new future? And considering how massive China is to this industry, that's a big question. At the beginning of this video, I said that China had next to no globally recognizable development studios despite its massive market share, but depending on how some of these games turn out and how China's laws continue to shape the landscape of the games industry there, that could be a hilariously off-base statement in just a few years' time. They have the resources and manpower to absolutely explode into the console game space in nearly an instant, establishing studios that are more than just money-milking machines and actually output creative and interesting games for us to play. At the drop of a hat, China can completely transform the games industry.